How to trust in God's love when you need new paths in 2026. There are moments when you don't need another sign. You need a new path. You've prayed. You've waited. You've tried to trust. And still, everything feels unclear. As 2026 approaches, your heart may be asking questions your mind cannot answer. Where do I go now? What if I choose wrong? What if nothing changes? This is where trust in God's love becomes more than words. Because trusting God is not about seeing the whole road. It's about taking one step when the future feels closed. When the old paths no longer work and the new ones haven't appeared yet, fear tries to speak louder than faith. But what if God's love is already guiding you, quietly, gently, even in this uncertainty? What if the confusion you feel is not the end, but the beginning of something new? If you need clarity, direction, and the courage to walk forward without forcing answers, stay here. This message is for you. There comes a moment when you realize that continuing hurts more than stopping. Not because you are weak, not because you failed, but because the path you've been walking no longer responds to who you are becoming. You wake up, do what you've always done, think the same thoughts, repeat the same prayers. Yet something inside feels disconnected. The answers that once brought comfort now feel distant. The direction that once felt right now feels heavy. And deep down, there is a quiet awareness you can't ignore anymore. This road no longer speaks to my soul. This moment is deeply unsettling. Because we are taught that persistence is always faith, that staying is always obedience, that leaving means giving up. But sometimes the discomfort you feel is not rebellion. It is alignment trying to happen. God's love does not always push you forward on the same road. Sometimes it gently withdraws the peace you once felt, not to punish you, but to wake you up. When the old path stops answering, it is often because it has already completed its purpose in your life. And this is where fear quietly enters. Fear whispers that you are being ungrateful, that questioning your direction means you don't trust God enough, that wanting something different means you are abandoning faith. But God's love is not fragile. It is not threatened by your questions. It is not offended by your honesty. In fact, many people reach new paths only after admitting a truth they were afraid to say out loud: I can't stay here anymore. This is not a dramatic declaration. It is a sacred one, because staying where your spirit is no longer nourished slowly drains your strength. You begin to feel tired without knowing why, confused without understanding the cause. You pray, but the words feel repetitive. You move, but without direction, and you start wondering if something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. What's happening is quieter than that. God's love may be loosening your grip on what once felt safe. Not everything that ends is broken. Some things simply expire, and when a path expires, it stops giving life. It stops producing clarity. It stops bringing peace. That doesn't mean it was a mistake. It means it served its season. The problem is that we often confuse familiarity with calling. We stay because we know the steps. We stay because leaving feels risky. We stay because we don't yet see where we would go. But God's love does not trap you in what no longer fits. It prepares you for what you cannot yet imagine. If the old path no longer answers you, it may be because your heart is being prepared for new language, a new way of trusting, a new way of walking, a new way of listening. And this moment, uncomfortable, confusing, uncertain, is not the absence of guidance. It is the threshold. You are not lost. You are standing between paths, and God's love is not behind you, disappointed. It is right here, patient, waiting to guide you forward. One of the hardest things to accept is that clarity rarely arrives when you demand it. Most people believe that once they understand the plan, they will finally be able to trust God. But in reality, trust is not built on understanding. It is built on surrender. You may be waiting for a clear sign, a certainty, a confirmation that removes all doubt. And until that happens, your heart stays tense, alert, almost guarded. You tell yourself that once things make sense, you will relax. Once the path is clear, you will move. Once God explains what He is doing, you will trust. But God's love works differently. Clarity is not the entrance to faith, it is the result of it. This is where surrender becomes misunderstood. Many people hear the word and imagine giving up, becoming passive or letting life decide everything. But surrender, in its deepest sense, is not weakness. It is alignment. It is the moment you stop trying to control the outcome and start allowing God's love to lead the process. Surrender does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop forcing. And forcing is exhausting. You force yourself to stay calm while anxiety builds. You force optimism when uncertainty feels overwhelming. You force decisions because waiting feels unbearable. But God's love does not ask you to force peace. It invites you to release resistance. There is a quiet shift that happens when surrender begins. You may not notice it immediately, but something inside softens. Your thoughts slow down. Your need for instant answers loosens its grip. You still don't know exactly where you're going, but you no longer feel the same urgency to figure everything out at once. This is not because your problems disappeared. It's because your posture changed. When you surrender, you stop standing against uncertainty and start standing within it, supported. And this is where clarity begins to form, not as a loud revelation, not as a dramatic sign, but as a subtle inner alignment. You start noticing what drains you instead of energizes you. You feel resistance toward things that once felt automatic. You sense peace around ideas that previously scared you. This is God's love guiding you quietly, without pressure. Surrender opens space. And clarity needs space to arrive. As long as your heart is clenched around fear, expectations, and timelines, there is no room for direction to settle. But when you loosen your grip, even slightly, something shifts. You begin to see patterns. You recognize what no longer belongs. You sense where your energy naturally flows. And slowly, without force, a path begins to take shape, not fully visible, not perfectly defined, but real enough to take the next step. This is why many people feel lost for so long, not because God is silent, but because surrender hasn't happened yet. They are still negotiating with fear, still demanding certainty, still trying to protect themselves from disappointment. But God's love does not require protection. It requires trust. And trust begins when you say, even quietly, I don't need to understand everything right now. I just need to be willing. That willingness changes everything. Because once you surrender the need to know the whole road, God's love can guide you one step at a time. And step by step, clarity grows, not from answers, but from movement aligned with faith. Surrender is not the end of your strength. It is the beginning of direction. There is a fear that rarely gets spoken out loud, especially by those who genuinely love God. It's not the fear of failing. It's not even the fear of pain. It's the fear of choosing wrong while trying to do right. You don't want to disappoint God. You don't want to move ahead of Him. You don't want to open a door that He never intended for you. So you hesitate. Every decision feels heavy because it carries more than consequences. It carries meaning. You replay choices in your mind, wondering if a different turn would pull you away from God's will. You question your desires. You doubt your intuition. And slowly, fear disguises itself as caution. But fear, when left unchecked, doesn't protect faith. It paralyzes it. This kind of fear often sounds spiritual on the surface. It tells you to wait longer, to pray more, to avoid risk. And while prayer and discernment are sacred, fear quietly adds a second voice, one that says, what if I mess everything up? What if I choose the wrong path and God steps back? What if I misread His guidance? What if I move and lose His favor? These questions don't come from rebellion. They come from reverence mixed with insecurity. But here is a truth that brings relief. God's love is not that fragile. It does not disappear because you make an imperfect decision. It does not abandon you because you move before feeling ready. It does not withdraw because you misunderstood something along the way. God's love is not a tightrope where one wrong step sends you falling. Many people confuse God's will with a single correct option, as if there is only one narrow choice and everything else is failure. This belief creates anxiety instead of trust. It turns faith into pressure. It makes every decision feel like a test you're afraid to fail. But God's love does not lead through intimidation. It leads through relationship. And relationships grow through movement, not immobility. When you love God, your heart is already oriented toward Him. That matters more than flawless decision-making. Even when you choose imperfectly, God's love remains active, guiding, adjusting, redirecting, not punishing. Sometimes the fear of choosing wrong keeps you stuck longer than any wrong choice ever could. You wait for perfect certainty, perfect peace, perfect confirmation. But perfection is not the language of trust. Trust speaks in willingness, in humility, in motion. And here's something few people realize. God often teaches through the path, not before it. You learn discernment by walking. You gain clarity by engaging life, not by standing still trying to predict every outcome. Loving God does not mean you will never make mistakes. It means you will never walk alone through them. God's love does not expect you to foresee everything. It asks you to stay connected, attentive, open. If your heart is sincere, if your desire is to walk in alignment, God's love has room to work, even when your steps are unsure. Fear tells you that choosing wrong will separate you from God. Love reminds you that nothing can. And when this truth settles in your heart, something loosens. The pressure eases. The fear softens. You begin to understand that trusting God is not about never stumbling. It's about knowing you will be guided, even if you do. So if you're afraid to move because you love God too much to choose wrong, hear this gently. Your love for Him already places you within His care. You don't need to freeze to stay faithful. You don't need perfection to stay connected. Sometimes the most faithful step is simply allowing yourself to move, trusting that God's love is wide enough to hold you, wherever the path unfolds. There is a season that tests trust more than pain ever could. It's the season when nothing feels confirmed. No clear signs, no strong peace, no unmistakable direction. Just a quiet sense that something is shifting, without proof. This is where many people struggle the most, because we often associate God's guidance with certainty. We expect clarity to feel solid, reassuring, undeniable. We look for emotional confirmation, a calm heart, a confident mind, a sense of, this is it. But what happens when none of that comes? You pray, yet your emotions remain unsettled. You wait, yet the situation doesn't resolve. You listen, yet the silence stretches longer than expected. And slowly, doubt begins to creep in, not because you lack faith, but because you lack confirmation. This is a fragile place to stand. Because without confirmation, fear tries to fill the gap. It tells you that if God were truly guiding you, things would feel clearer. That if you were on the right path, you would feel more certain. That uncertainty must mean you are doing something wrong. But God's love does not always come wrapped in reassurance. Sometimes it comes disguised as quiet endurance. There are moments when God does not confirm the path emotionally, not because it's wrong, but because He is teaching you to trust beyond feeling. Emotional certainty is comforting, but it is not the foundation of faith. Faith matures when it learns to stand without constant validation. Trusting God when nothing feels confirmed means choosing to believe that His love is present, even when your emotions are unstable. It means understanding that fear and faith can coexist, and that fear does not cancel God's guidance. Many people wait for certainty before they move. But sometimes, certainty only comes after movement. God often invites trust at a deeper level, one that does not rely on signs, feelings, or immediate peace. This kind of trust is quieter, stronger, less dramatic. It is the trust that says, I don't feel sure, but I am willing. I don't feel calm, but I am open. I don't see confirmation, but I believe God's love is still leading me. This is not blind faith, it is anchored faith. Anchored in who God is, not in how you feel today. There is also a hidden grace in unconfirmed seasons. Without clear answers, you are less likely to rush, less likely to move out of impulse, less likely to confuse excitement with calling. You move more carefully, more prayerfully, more aware. And in that awareness, God's love works quietly, shaping your discernment from the inside. Trust without confirmation teaches you to listen differently. You begin to notice subtle alignments instead of loud signs. You pay attention to what brings peace over time, not instant relief. You sense when something drains you, even if it looks good on the surface. This is how God guides many people into new paths, not with certainty, but with consistency. A consistent pull, a repeated nudge, a gentle persistence that doesn't fade. If you are waiting for everything to feel confirmed before you trust God, you may be waiting longer than necessary, because sometimes God is not asking you to feel ready. He is asking you to lean. Lean into His love. Lean into obedience without emotional guarantees. Lean into the next step, even if your heart is still catching up. Trusting God when nothing feels confirmed is one of the purest expressions of faith. It says, I trust you not because I feel secure, but because I know who you are. And in time, often quietly, often unexpectedly, confirmation arrives. Not always as certainty, but as peace that grows as you walk. You don't need everything to feel clear to trust God's love. You only need the courage to keep listening, even in the silence. Waiting on God can look very similar to being stuck, but they are not the same. And confusing the two can quietly delay the new paths God is opening. Waiting carries movement inside, even when nothing changes outside. Being stuck feels heavy, stagnant, and disconnected from hope. Many people tell themselves they are waiting on God, when in reality, fear has taken the lead. Fear of choosing wrong, fear of losing control, fear of stepping forward without certainty. And fear is patient, but not in a healthy way. It keeps you suspended, convincing you that stillness equals faith. But waiting on God is not passive. Waiting is attentive. Waiting is surrendered. Waiting is alive. When you are truly waiting, your heart remains open. You stay responsive. You remain willing to move when the time comes. There is tension, yes, but also trust. You don't rush, but you don't shut down either. Being stuck feels different. When you are stuck, your thoughts loop. You replay the same questions without new insight. Your prayers feel repetitive, almost mechanical. You feel tired not because you're doing too much, but because you're doing nothing while carrying fear. Stuckness drains hope. Waiting preserves it. God's love does not ask you to freeze your life while you wait. It invites you to stay present, grounded, and engaged, even when the future is unclear. Waiting is not about pausing your existence. It's about pausing your control. This is where many people struggle, because letting go of control feels unsafe. Doing nothing feels safer than doing something uncertain. So you remain in familiar discomfort, telling yourself that patience is the reason, when deep down, avoidance is quietly shaping your choices. But God's love is not found in avoidance. It is found in discernment. Discernment is active. It involves listening, reflecting, adjusting. It asks you to notice what is growing and what is shrinking inside you. It helps you sense when a season of waiting is complete, even if the next step still feels intimidating. Sometimes, waiting ends not with a sign, but with a loss of peace in staying. You begin to feel restless, not anxious, but unsettled. The place you're in no longer feels aligned. The excuses you once used no longer satisfy your heart. And something inside whispers that staying still is costing you more than moving would. That whisper matters. God often moves us forward not by pushing us but by making stagnation uncomfortable. And that discomfort is not cruelty, it is guidance. Waiting becomes stuckness when you stop listening, when fear replaces openness, when you cling to the idea that God must make everything obvious before you move. But God's love often guides through internal readiness, not external certainty. Waiting keeps your spirit soft. Being stuck hardens it. If you notice bitterness growing, hope fading, or numbness settling in, it may not be a season of waiting anymore. It may be time to gently ask yourself, am I trusting God here, or protecting myself? God's love does not shame you for asking this question. It welcomes honesty. Because new paths don't always begin with clarity. Sometimes they begin when you admit that staying where you are no longer reflects trust. It reflects fear. Waiting honors God when it remains connected to faith. Being stuck disconnects you from movement, even internal movement. And God's love is always moving, shaping, preparing, aligning. If you feel caught between waiting and stagnation, pause, not to freeze, but to listen. God may not be asking you to run ahead, but He may be asking you to stop hiding behind stillness. Sometimes the next step is not a leap, it's simply a willingness to move again. And God's love will meet you there. Many people expect new paths to feel like rewards, like confirmation that everything you endured finally paid off, like relief, ease, or visible progress. But God's love doesn't always move that way. Sometimes, instead of rewarding, it redirects. And redirection can feel confusing, even disappointing, at first. You may have hoped that trusting God would lead to something bigger, clearer, or more comfortable. You may have expected doors to open smoothly, resistance to fade, and peace to arrive instantly. But instead, you find yourself facing humility, simplification, or a step that feels smaller than what you imagined. This is where trust is tested again. Because redirection doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't always look like success. And it rarely aligns with personal expectations. God's love is not concerned with appearances. It is concerned with alignment. Sometimes what you call a setback is actually a safeguard. Sometimes what feels like loss is protection you cannot yet see. Sometimes the path that looks unimpressive is the one that keeps your heart intact. Redirection often happens quietly. There is no dramatic ending, no clear explanation, just a gradual sense that what you were pursuing no longer fits. You begin to feel pulled away from goals that once excited you. Your energy shifts, your priorities change, and something inside resists returning to the old direction. This can be unsettling, because redirection forces you to let go of narratives you built around yourself. Narratives about where you thought you were going, about who you thought you needed to become, about what you believed God was going to do next. Letting go of those expectations feels like losing something, even if they were never promised. But God's love does not redirect to punish. It redirects to preserve. Preserve your peace. Preserve your humility. Preserve your relationship with Him. Many people miss new paths because they are waiting for them to feel like victory. They expect God's guidance to always elevate, expand, or impress. But often, God chooses paths that heal before they elevate. He addresses what is fragile before what is visible. A redirected path may ask you to slow down when you want to accelerate. It may invite you to simplify when you want to grow. It may call you inward when you were focused outward. And this feels counterintuitive. But God's love sees the whole picture, not just the destination, but what the journey will do to your heart. He knows when a reward would actually overwhelm you. He knows when success would distract you. He knows when recognition would cost you more than it gives. So instead, He redirects. Not to delay your life, but to realign it. Redirection requires a deeper kind of trust. One that doesn't depend on visible progress. One that doesn't demand immediate validation. One that believes that God's love is guiding even when the path feels quieter than expected. This is where many people struggle. Because redirection feels like starting over, and starting over carries grief. For what could have been, for what you imagined, for what you hoped would happen by now. God's love does not dismiss that grief. It meets you inside it. Because redirection is not erasure. Nothing you walked through was wasted. Nothing you learned disappears. Every step still shaped you. Every season still prepared you. God's love simply chooses the path that continues that preparation, even if it doesn't look like a reward yet. If you are experiencing redirection instead of reward, pause before interpreting it as failure. Ask yourself gently, what is being protected here? What is being preserved? Sometimes the most loving thing God can do is move you away from something that looks good, but isn't good for you. And when you trust His love through redirection, clarity comes later, strength comes later, and peace settles deeper than it ever could have on a path chosen only for comfort. God's love does not always take you where you expected, but it always takes you where you are meant to grow. One of the quiet shocks of stepping into a new path is realizing how lonely it can feel. Not because you are abandoned, but because alignment often separates you before it connects you again. When God's love begins to lead you somewhere new, familiar voices may fade. People who once understood you may no longer relate to your choices. The rhythm you shared with others shifts, and suddenly, you're walking at a pace that feels different from the one around you. This loneliness can be confusing, especially when you're trusting God. You may ask yourself why obedience feels isolating. Why following God's guidance doesn't immediately bring community, affirmation, or shared excitement. You expected peace, not distance, connection, not silence. But loneliness at the beginning of a new path is not rejection. It is separation for preparation. God's love often creates space before it creates belonging. In this space, external validation grows quiet. You're no longer surrounded by constant reassurance or familiar feedback. And without those voices, your inner world becomes louder. Doubts surface, old fears resurface. Questions you avoided now demand attention. This is not a mistake in the process, it is the process. New paths require inner clarity before external alignment. God often removes distractions so you can hear His guidance without interference. When others step back, it's not always because they disapprove. Sometimes it's because the season requires intimacy with God before intimacy with direction. Loneliness sharpens discernment. Without constant opinions shaping your thoughts, you begin to notice what genuinely resonates with your spirit. You learn to listen without rushing to explain yourself. You discover what you believe when no one is watching, applauding, or correcting you. This is uncomfortable, but it is powerful. Many people abandon new paths because they confuse loneliness with error. They assume that if God were truly guiding them, they would feel more supported. But support does not always arrive at the beginning. Sometimes it arrives after you commit. God's love is not proven by crowds. It is proven by presence. And His presence does not leave you in lonely seasons. It meets you there. In solitude, your motivations are purified. You begin to recognize which desires were shaped by expectation rather than calling. You notice how much of your identity depended on being understood. And slowly, you start anchoring yourself not in approval but in obedience. This is where trust deepens. Loneliness forces you to ask honest questions. Am I doing this because it's right, or because it's comfortable? Would I still walk this path if no one affirmed it? These questions don't weaken faith, they refine it. God's love uses solitude to strengthen your inner voice, the one that will guide you when no one else can. Because the path ahead will require confidence that does not depend on consensus. And here is something gentle but important to remember. Loneliness is often temporary. It marks a transition, not a destination. As you walk further into alignment, new connections begin to form. People who resonate with your growth appear. Relationships shift, not always in number, but in depth. And the support you receive becomes quieter, but more genuine. But that comes later. First comes solitude. First comes listening. First comes learning to trust God without external reinforcement. If you are feeling lonely as you step into something new, don't rush back to what feels familiar just to avoid discomfort. Familiarity can feel like safety, but it can also keep you from growth. God's love does not isolate you to harm you. It separates you to prepare you. This lonely stretch is not evidence that you're on the wrong path. It may be evidence that you are finally walking one that requires maturity, depth, and personal trust. You are not unseen. You are not unsupported. You are being strengthened in ways that will soon make sense. And when connection returns, it will feel different, quieter, truer, aligned. Until then, let solitude do its work. Let God's love become your anchor. And trust that this season, though lonely, is not empty. One of the most misunderstood ideas about faith is the belief that trust should always feel calm. That if God's love is truly guiding you, your emotions will settle, your fears will fade, and peace will come naturally. But real trust often begins before emotional certainty arrives. There are seasons when your heart feels unsettled even as you walk in obedience. You move forward, yet doubt follows you. You choose faith, but anxiety still visits. And this creates confusion, because you expected trust to feel lighter than this. So you start questioning yourself. If I'm trusting God, why do I still feel afraid? If this path is right, why don't I feel at peace yet? These questions are honest, and they don't mean you're failing at faith. They mean you're human. Emotions respond to uncertainty faster than faith does. Your mind tries to protect you from risk. Your body reacts to change before your spirit fully settles. And in this space, emotions can be loud, even when God's love is steady. Trusting without emotional certainty means understanding that feelings are not indicators of alignment. They are signals of transition, and transitions are rarely comfortable. God's love does not promise emotional calm at every step. It promises presence. Presence in the fear. Presence in the doubt. Presence in the moments when you're doing the right thing and still feel unsure. Many people wait for emotional peace before they commit. But emotional peace often follows commitment, not the other way around. It grows as your nervous system adjusts, as your heart learns safety again, as your mind realizes that you are not alone on this path. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move while fear still exists. And God's love honors that decision. There is also a deeper maturity that forms when you stop demanding emotional confirmation. You begin to trust God for who He is, not for how safe He makes you feel in the moment. Your faith becomes less dependent on mood and more rooted in relationship. This kind of trust is quieter, less dramatic, more resilient. You stop asking, "Do I feel okay?" and start asking, "Am I staying connected?" Connection matters more than comfort. God's love does not disappear when your emotions fluctuate. It remains consistent when your inner world feels unstable. And slowly, as you continue walking, something shifts. The fear doesn't vanish, but it loosens. The anxiety doesn't disappear, but it no longer leads. Peace arrives differently than you expected, not as a sudden feeling, but as steadiness over time. You notice that you're still standing, still moving, still held, and that realization builds confidence. Trusting without emotional certainty teaches you that God's love is not fragile. It does not depend on your emotional state. It holds you when you are confident and when you are trembling, when you feel strong and when you feel unsure. If you are waiting to feel emotionally ready before trusting God, you may wait longer than necessary. Because readiness is not a feeling, it is a posture that says, "I may not feel secure yet, but I choose to stay open. I may still feel afraid, but I will not let fear decide. I may not feel peace now, but I believe it will grow as I walk." God's love meets you in that posture, and over time, emotional certainty begins to follow spiritual commitment. Not perfectly, not instantly, but faithfully. You don't need to feel calm to trust God's love. You need to stay willing, and willingness, carried consistently, becomes peace. One of the most painful parts of finding new paths is realizing that they often require you to release an old version of yourself, not because that version was wrong, but because it no longer fits where God's love is leading you. You may not even notice this resistance at first. It shows up quietly, as hesitation, nostalgia, or an unexplainable sadness when you consider change. You feel attached not just to places or plans, but to an identity you built to survive earlier seasons, who you had to be to endure, who you had to become to stay strong, who you had to perform as to be accepted, useful, or safe. And letting go of that version feels like losing protection, because identities form around pain as much as purpose. They shield you. They help you cope. They give you structure when life feels unstable. So when God's love invites you toward something new, it also invites you to loosen your grip on roles that once kept you upright. This is not easy. You may ask yourself, if I'm not this person anymore, who am I? If I don't hold myself together this way, what happens? If I stop proving, achieving, fixing, or enduring, will I still matter? These questions are deeply human, but God's love does not call you to erase your past self. It calls you to release the weight that self was carrying. Sometimes you are not afraid of new paths. You are afraid of who you will be without the old armor. Armor you no longer need, but don't know how to live without yet. Letting go of identity is harder than letting go of direction, because direction tells you where to go. Identity tells you who you are allowed to be. New paths often require vulnerability instead of strength, trust instead of control, presence instead of performance, and that can feel like weakness, but it isn't. It is maturity. God's love does not need you to stay rigid to keep you safe. It invites you to soften so you can grow. The version of you that survived may not be the version meant to flourish. This is why change often brings grief, not for what you lost, but for who you were. You mourn the familiarity of your old self. You miss the certainty of knowing how to show up. You feel disoriented without the patterns that once defined you. And this grief deserves space. God's love does not rush you through it. It walks with you inside it. Because releasing an identity is not abandonment. It is transition. You are not becoming less, you are becoming more aligned. When you let go of who you thought you had to be, you create space for who you are becoming to emerge naturally, without force, without pretending, without carrying unnecessary weight. This is where trust deepens again. Trusting God's love here means believing that you don't need to hold yourself together the way you used to, that you don't need to be constantly strong, useful, or impressive to be guided, that you are allowed to evolve. And evolution often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. If you feel unsettled not because of where you're going, but because of who you're becoming, pause. This discomfort is not failure. It is evidence that something old is loosening. God's love is not asking you to disappear. It is inviting you to arrive, more whole, more honest, more at peace. New paths don't just change your direction. They change your relationship with yourself. And as you release the version of you that no longer fits, God's love begins to shape a new one, not built on survival, but on trust. Not every new path begins with a dramatic change. Some begin with a quiet inner alignment that is almost easy to overlook. God's love often guides you not by sudden events, but by subtle shifts inside you. Your desires change before your circumstances do. What once felt urgent loses intensity. What once felt distant begins to feel familiar. And slowly, without announcement, your inner compass adjusts. This kind of guidance can feel confusing because it doesn't demand attention. There is no moment where everything clicks at once. No clear signal telling you, this is it. Instead, there is a gradual sense of alignment, a feeling that some things no longer require effort, while others now feel forced. Quiet alignment shows up in small ways. You stop resisting certain truths. You feel less pressure to explain yourself. You notice peace in places that once scared you. This is not coincidence, it is direction forming internally before it appears externally. God's love often works this way because alignment lasts longer than excitement. External signs can motivate you temporarily, but internal alignment sustains you when the path becomes demanding. When your heart and values shift first, your steps follow naturally. Many people miss this kind of guidance because they are looking for urgency. They expect God's direction to feel intense, obvious, or emotionally charged. But quiet alignment is gentle. It doesn't rush you. It simply becomes harder to ignore over time. You may notice that forcing yourself back into old habits feels unnatural. Conversations feel draining where they once felt normal. Goals lose meaning. And this doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, as God's love reshapes your priorities from the inside out. This kind of guidance asks for attentiveness, not urgency. It requires you to slow down enough to notice what brings lasting peace instead of temporary relief. To observe where your energy flows without resistance. To recognize when something feels right, not because it excites you, but because it settles you. Quiet alignment does not eliminate fear. It gives fear less authority. You may still feel uncertain about outcomes. You may still have questions. But the inner resistance fades. You stop arguing with yourself. You stop negotiating your values. And this creates a grounded confidence that doesn't need constant reassurance. God's love guides you by bringing your inner world into agreement with His direction. When alignment happens, obedience becomes less about effort and more about response. You're no longer pushing yourself forward. You're responding to what feels increasingly natural. This is why God often delays visible change. He waits for internal alignment first. Because once your heart is aligned, the external steps no longer feel like sacrificing, they feel like continuation. If you are unsure whether God is guiding you right now, pay attention to what is quietly aligning. Notice what no longer fits without explanation. Observe where peace grows steadily, even if fear still visits. God's love does not rush alignment, it deepens it. And when alignment is complete enough, movement follows without force. New paths don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they whisper, until you realize you've already begun walking. There is a moment in every new path where understanding lags behind obedience. You are already walking, but you still don't fully know why. You have already said yes, but the meaning of that yes hasn't unfolded yet. This is one of the most uncomfortable places to be, because we are taught to understand first, then act, to analyze, predict, and secure the outcome before committing. But God's love often invites movement before explanation, not to confuse you but to grow you. Walking before understanding requires humility. It asks you to admit that you don't need to have every answer in order to be faithful. That certainty is not a prerequisite for obedience. That trust is not built on comprehension, but on relationship. At this stage, questions still exist. Doubts still surface. You may still wonder if this path will make sense later. And it will, but not yet. Understanding often arrives after experience. After you've taken steps, faced resistance, encountered grace, and seen how God meets you along the way. Insight grows from participation, not from speculation. God's love knows this. That is why He often invites you to move while clarity remains incomplete. Because movement reveals things that stillness never could. It exposes what is real. It teaches discernment through lived experience, not imagined outcomes. When you walk before understanding, you begin to see patterns. You notice how certain choices bring life while others drain it. You learn what aligns and what doesn't through interaction, not theory. And slowly, meaning starts to form, not all at once, but piece by piece. This can feel unsettling, especially if you value control. Because walking without full understanding means accepting vulnerability. It means allowing yourself to be taught along the way. It means trusting that God's love is not withholding clarity, it is timing it. There is also freedom here. When you stop demanding immediate understanding, pressure lifts. You no longer need to justify every step. You no longer need to explain your path to yourself or others in advance. You are allowed to learn as you go. God's love does not rush explanations. It prioritizes formation, and formation happens in motion. If you are walking a path you don't fully understand yet, don't interpret that as a mistake. This stage is not confusion. It is initiation. You are being introduced to something that cannot be grasped intellectually before it is lived. Understanding will come. But first comes trust. Then comes experience. Then comes meaning. Walking before understanding teaches you to rely on God's presence instead of your own certainty. It anchors your faith not in answers, but in companionship. And that kind of trust changes you. You become less anxious about outcomes, less dependent on timelines, more attentive to the moment you are actually in. God's love does not ask you to walk blindly. It asks you to walk with Him. And walking with Him is enough, even when understanding has not caught up yet. There is a subtle pressure that appears as a new season approaches, a pressure to decide, to define, to make the future make sense before it arrives. As 2026 draws near, you may feel that pressure quietly building, the urge to have answers, plans, direction. You look ahead and wonder who you're supposed to be by then, what you're supposed to have figured out, and whether you're already behind. But God's love does not ask you to force the future. Forcing the future is what happens when fear takes the lead. When uncertainty feels unbearable, you rush to fill the unknown with decisions that offer temporary relief, but long-term misalignment. You choose speed over discernment, certainty over truth, control over trust, and it costs you peace. Stepping into a new season with God looks different. It's not about locking everything into place. It's about carrying the right posture forward, a posture of openness, of responsiveness, of trust that does not depend on prediction. God's love prepares you for the future not by giving you all the answers, but by shaping how you respond when answers are missing. You don't enter 2026 needing to know everything. You enter it willing to listen, to adjust, to stay aligned. This is what it means to trust God's love without forcing outcomes. You release the need to arrive fully formed. You stop measuring your worth by timelines. You allow growth to unfold organically instead of demanding it all at once. And something gentle happens when you do this. The future no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a continuation. You stop bracing yourself for what's coming and start trusting that God's love will meet you there, just as it has met you here. You realize that you don't have to outrun uncertainty. You can walk alongside it, grounded in faith. Stepping into 2026 without forcing the future means allowing space for change, space for redirection, space for becoming someone you haven't fully imagined yet. And this space is not empty. It is filled with God's presence. God's love does not rush seasons. It completes them. If you feel tempted to force clarity, pause. Ask yourself gently, am I trying to control what God is still shaping? Trust grows when you stop tightening your grip on what hasn't arrived yet. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not failing. You are walking, and that is enough. God's love does not require you to step into the future prepared for everything. It asks you to step forward available to learn, available to be guided, available to trust even when the path unfolds slowly. And when you enter a new season this way, you don't carry fear with you. You carry faith. Not loud faith, not forced faith, but steady faith, the kind that knows you don't need to see the whole road, only the next step, and God's love is already there. There is a verse that speaks directly to moments like this, moments when the path ahead is unclear, when trust feels fragile, and when new directions seem hidden. It is found in Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. This passage does not promise instant clarity. It does not say you will understand everything. It does not say the road will be easy or predictable. What it offers is something deeper, an invitation to trust with your heart, not your certainty, an invitation to release the need to fully understand before moving, an assurance that when you place your steps in God's hands, He takes responsibility for the path itself. He will make your path straight does not mean effortless. It means guided. It means aligned. It means watched over. This verse reminds us that God's love does not wait for you to figure everything out before He leads you forward. It meets you in surrender. It meets you in trust. It meets you exactly where understanding ends. And that is often where new paths truly begin. You don't need to see the whole road to trust God's love. You only need the courage to take the next step. New paths don't begin with certainty. They begin with willingness. Willingness to let go of control. Willingness to walk without guarantees. Willingness to believe that God is already ahead of you. If your heart feels unsure, that does not mean you are far from God. It may mean you are standing exactly where trust is being formed. As you step forward, carry this with you into 2026. God's love is not waiting at the end of the journey. It is walking with you, step by step, even now. And that is enough.